Hello, everyone. I just started a few minutes early. I look like crap today. I literally just woke up. I had a late night visitor. If you know what I mean. On the search for Spartacus. That's going to be the name of my online book. How is everyone today? Are we all doing good? Are we all alert? Are we all awake? Is anybody there? Yes, we're listening to World War II readings. That's part of your resume. One second, let me stop the camera. One second. Hi, Susan. We are about to start this reading. And if you guys are interested, I found another good book afterwards that's not as depressing. Hi, Carl. Are we ready to get this going? So we might only need one more day left to read this book. We're going to start with Ibato-san. Ibato-san says, during the time when I was in an internment camp in Siberia, when we were doing outdoor manual labor, an old man came up to me and he asked me a question. Is this gulag? Do you get enough to eat in the gulag? He asked me, and when I said, no, I don't. This was in Siberia. He took an apple out of a bag. That apple, I believe, was a very precious apple from somewhere near the Ukraine. He held that one apple out to me. That was in the midst of the cruel, harsh Siberian life, the most moved, happy I felt. There was such a genuine affection for this fellow man there that it left an impression on me that I'm not sure will ever go away. That's the feeling I got. This is, whatever race you may be, you take the hand of your fellow man and there is no war. This is a quote from Adam Smith's book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. How selfish soever man may be supposed, there are evidently some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortune of others, and render their happiness necessary to him, though he derives nothing from it except the pleasure of seeing. Of this kind is pity or compassion, the emotion which we feel for the misery of others, when we either see it or are made to conceive it in a very lively manner. We know something about what makes people perform evil acts, but what makes people resist performing evil acts or perform altruistic ones? One way of defining altruism is this. It is voluntary, intentional behavior that helps others. The helping is itself the goal of the behavior, and it is done without the expectation of external reward. The kind of self-sacrifice and generosity is less salient but more common human behavior than cruelty. It sutures the moments of each day. The most basic social units, families, neighborhoods, are impossible without it. But does that mean altruism exists? In a meaningful sense, does self-sacrificing behavior, for instance, surrendering your well-being to care for a child or an aging parent, or, for that matter, resisting orders to harm others despite the threat of ostracism or punishment, reveal a principle of human motivation that transcends self-interest? Hi, Valley Girl. There are reasons to think not. Rational actor theory and social biology offer a range of ways to reframe ostensibly self-sacrificing behavior as selflessness. We choose to help because it gives us the pleasure of maintaining a pleasing, benevolent self-conception. We choose to help because we want, as a matter of self-care, to unburden ourselves of the unpleasant sensation of watching others suffer. We choose to help because we've been trained to fear disapproval or punishment for not helping. We choose to help because we've been trained to expect approval or reward for helping. We choose to help because it's not the only way we can rationally sustain our soothing belief that others would help us too if we were in grave need. We choose to help because it expresses and solidifies our social status. That is, we believe that when others accept our help, they tactically acknowledge their dependency and inferiority to us. We choose to help because we have a taste for it. A taste, writes Howard Margolis, not necessarily different in character from a taste for fancy motor cars or dollar cigars. At the most basic level, altruists and egoists are the same. They both are just utility maximizers. Or perhaps we don't choose to help at all. We can't help but help. And when we help, what we're really doing is helping ourselves. This explanation is what evolutionary biologists call inclusive fitness theory, because life is brutal. Darwinian struggle for individual survival, altruists would simply self-eradicate over time as they sacrifice their survival advantages to benefit others. But altruism persists, instead thrives, because fitness, success at reproducing ourselves through breeding, is gene-based, not body-based. That is, when a human or non-human animal sacrifices its interest to support its kin, it is jeopardizing genetic reproduction in one body, but enhancing the likelihood of the same genetic reproduction in other bodies. The calculus of advantage all depends on the math. How closely related, how many kin, how great the risk. As the pioneering evolutionary biologist J.B.S. Haldane is reported to have quipped, when asked if he would risk his life to save a drowning brother, "No, but I would to save 2 brothers or 8 cousins." Among the more repugnant implications of such a world view is this claim: a parent will experience the most intense grief over a child's death when the death occurs during adolescence, because this is the child's reproductive potential peak. Just as a horse breeder is more disappointed by the death of a thoroughbred the day before its race than the day after its birth, explains Robert Wright of the inclusive fitness theory, a parent should be more heartbroken by the death of an adolescent than by the death of an infant. That's so weird. In other words, when we see love or altruism or any kind of rescue behavior, we may think we are seeing something nobly unselfish, but what's really happening is nothing more than the dumb work of, in Richard Dawkins' blunt words, survival machines, robot vehicles blindly programmed to preserve the selfish molecules known as genes. So we are not altruists in any meaningful sense of the word. We are either rational actors driven by self-interest, or we are herd animals. The pioneering evolutionary biologist George William writes, as a general rule, a modern biologist seeing an animal do something to benefit another assumes either that it is being manipulated by the other individual or that it is being subtly selfish. And I totally agree with that. Like charity, like people do charity because at the end of the day that makes them feel good that they did something good. So I mean, it makes sense to me. I don't know if you guys agree. There's only 2 people watching. That's pretty low. That's a low number. Most recently, however, the renowned biologist E.O. Wilson has argued that the foundations of inclusive fitness theory are crumbling. His research is about eosocial behavior, a special case of what evolutionary biologists consider extreme altruism. Wilson's argument is complex, controversial, and certain to be tested in the ensuing years, but the basic claim is that self-sacrifice for the common good simply cannot be redescribed as genetic selfishness. Close genetic relatedness, he writes, is a consequence, not the cause of eusocial behavior. In loose translation, individuals did not cooperate because they were families. Individuals that cooperated became families. Human beings are prone to be moral, do the right thing, hold back, give aid to others, sometimes even at personal risk, because natural selection has favored those interactions of group members benefiting the group as a whole. Wilson concludes, authentic altruism exists. A great deal of energy has gone into disproving of altruism on other intellectual fronts. Multiple studies have been designed, for instance, to test the adverse arousal reduction theory of altruism. That is, we only help to relieve ourselves of the distress associated with exposures to another's suffering. That makes a lot of sense. Because it makes us uncomfortable to see people suffering. So if we could stop it, that makes us feel better. And I think at the end of the day that trumps the actual person that's suffering. I don't really know CIX. I'll have to look at that, Lou. It seems the explanatory power of the theory is weak, successful accounting for behavior only when personal distress is high and empathy is low. In another study focusing on Central European rescuers of Jews during the Holocaust, researchers concluded that rational actor theory is of little or no use in explaining rescue activity. Rescuers' motivations did not include a cost-benefit analysis. Cluster pressures, expectation of reward, or the desire to feel good about themselves. Many seemed reluctant to talk about their experience afterward and did not maintain contact with those they had rescued. Hoffman speculates that in some way shame may have adhered to the act of helping. Shame about what was required of them both, the degree of dehumanization that had to be reached in order for the need for such hiding to arise. It's hard to account for such behaviors through models of self-interest. Many have argued more generally that the explanatory power of the classic self-interested human model of economic theory has deficiencies so significant that it must be radically reconsidered. In the late 1970s, Nobel Prize-winning economist Amartya Sen attacks this narrow assumption that every agent is actuated only by self-interest, insisting on the importance of ethical commitments that cannot be redefined as self-interest, unless self-interest is only the empty tautology which one chooses to do. The purely economic man, he wrote, is indeed close to being a social moron. More recently, and further left on the political spectrum, economist Robert Rowthorne has attacked the postulate of selfishness which still underlies most economic theorizing, and the absence of any significant role for ethical or moral consideration and most analysis of economic activity. The self-interest model predicts, for instance, that rational actors will contribute less to and consume more than their fair share of public goods when given the chance, the free rider hypothesis, and that this will lead to a minimal production and maintenance of public goods. If I can get out of paying my fair share of taxes, I should and will. But when we all think this way, everybody loses. Global fisheries and carbon emissions are apocalyptic examples of this problem, but research on free riding has produced mixed results. Funnily enough, some studies suggest that if you want to get evidence showing that people are inherently self-interested and will therefore free ride, the best way to do so is to use economists and economic students as experimental subjects. Are economists just good at seeing when they're supposed to be playing a free riding game in the experiments, or does continual exposure to the self-interested man model train economists to think in a way that promotes free riding? In her words on Tragedy of the Commons, political scientist Elinor Ostrom, another Nobel Prize winner, finds multiple cases in which self-organizing groups effectively manage common pool resources despite the temptation of a free ride. While not evidence against the idea that we are egoists governed by selfishness, long-term cooperation involving internal sanctions is rather easily explained as self-interest and nonetheless provides grounds for optimism about our capacity for pro-social collaborative action. But rather than getting into a long discussion of fundamental questions such as, are we governed by self-interest or does altruism exist? Let me return to the question I posed earlier, now rephrased. We know something about what makes people perform evil acts, but what makes people perform behaviors we call altruistic? There is an astonishing symmetry to these two very different processes. 1. Bystanders are more likely to be passive and perpetrators to be cruel when the victim is anonymous. When a victim's identity is recognizable, by contrast, it inhibits aggression and promotes altruism. The same logic applies to those observing the potential victim. An observer who feels personally anonymous is more likely to be impulsively antisocial or passive in the face of others' needs, while an observer who feels recognizable is more likely to engage in pro-social behavior and feel a heightened sense of responsibility to others. In one variation of the Milgram study, for instance, subjects delivered more shocks to victims when they played a subsidiary role in the process, as compared to subjects who delivered the shock directly. Indeed, when subjects were forced to deliver shocks by physically touching the victim, compliance dropped dramatically. Hi, Phil. Yeah, I'm doing all right. I hope you are too. Relatedly, Alliner and Alliner found in their study of Holocaust rescuers that previous close contact with the victims played a significant part in helping behavior. Bystander passivity experiments confirm this pattern. Subjects are more likely to respond with helping behavior for victims whom they have previously met, even if only briefly. 2. If perceiving victims as an out-group decreases the likelihood that they will help them, perceiving victims as in-group increases the likelihood that we will. Indeed, the in-group effect seems to determine not only what hold victims have upon us, but also what hold others helpers have upon us. That is, we are more likely to help if we believe that the others helping are in-group than if we believe they are out-group. Muzaffar Sharif's robber's cave experiment is one of the most famous psychological studies on intergroup conflict. Posing as a janitor at a summer camp for 12-year-old boys, Sharif observed the rapid formation of bitterly opposed in-groups. Here's a sample of his observations. The Eagles, especially, were dead set against participating in an activity which had anything whatsoever to do with the Rattlers. In an early morning swim that day, the Eagles had discovered their flag in the water, burned the previous evening by the Rattlers. Upon making this discovery, they denounced the Rattlers as dirty bums and accused them of having put ice in the water because it appeared to one of them as colder than usual, and of throwing rocks in their creek because one of them stubbed his toe a number of times during the swim. Sharif determined that the most effective way to reduce intergroup hostility was to introduce superordinate goals. for the Eagles and the Rattlers, that is, to impose challenges that can only be resolved through cooperation. For instance, he caused a drinking water shortage that required everybody to work together, and later made the cost of screening a desired movie prohibitive for campers unless they collectively pooled their resources. Sufficiently motivating superordinate goals, in effect, made everybody in group. Oh yeah, it is Canada. I have no clue what Canada Day is. Number 3, where information scarcity, for instance, in the form of censorship or euphemism, makes it easier for bystanders to ignore or support atrocities, information plenitude makes it more difficult. Information is coercive, hence the phenomenon of empathy avoidance, because we know that we will be distressed by the suffering of others and that this distress might cause us to make personal sacrifices to help. We seek to avoid information that could elicit our empathy, especially personalizing information about people we expect to have hurt. Relatedly, economists find in studies of the free rider hypothesis that selfishness and exploitation of others is maximized under conditions of anonymity and disconnection from others, and is reduced when individuals have the capacity to personally communicate. As Ostrom said in her Nobel Prize interview on the problem of free riding, humans are neither all angels or all devils. It is the context and institutional context in which they find themselves that enable them to have more willingness to use reciprocity and to trust each other. 4, where lack of visible dissent promotes conformity to antisocial behavior, visible dissent promotes defections. In variations of the Osh and Milgram experiments, for instance, subjects who are much more capable of resisting pressure from groups or authority figures when they saw even one other Confederate resisting. Hi, Jode. I love you. I hope everything's well. Arndt, discussing the trial of Eichmann, argues in his spirit that public defection is a moral responsibility. Private defection, however courageous, is a kind of failure. Probst Gruber was a German clergyman who ended up in concentration camp because of his efforts to resist the Nazis. In his encounters with Eichmann, however, Gruber refrained from moral critique. Arndt notes approvingly that on this point, Eichmann's otherwise passive defense lawyer began to press. Did you try to influence him? Did you, as a clergyman, try to appeal to his feelings, preach to him, and tell him that his conduct was contrary to morality? Of course, the very courageous Probst had done nothing of the sort, and his answers now were highly embarrassing. He said that deeds are more effective than words, and that words would have been useless. He spoke in cliches that had nothing to do with the real reality of the situation, where mere words would have been deeds, and where it had perhaps been the duty of the clergyman to test the uselessness of words. There is, in other words, no such thing as merely symbolic protest. 5. If we are less likely to help when victims are distant, intervention seems costly, and the situation is unclear or confusing. We are more likely to help when we are approached in person for help, and when the helping situation is less costly, unambiguous, and highly urgent. UN Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs Jan Egeland explains the way different narrative frames can affect willingness to intervene. Comparing the massive global interest in the 2003 tsunami to the total near indifference to the conflict in Uganda and the DRC, he says, number 1, they're in an endless cycle of misery and people do not like endless cycles. Number 2, it's not so clear who's the good and the bad, and as it may be with the tsunami. Nature is bad, people are good, and aid workers succeed. It's a good story to tell. In Uganda, it's incomprehensible terror carried out by a elusive rebel force that nobody knows. In Eastern Congo, it's even murkier. It's not just one rebel movement, it's 20 different armed groups. Hi, Talana. Okay, Lou. Number 6, if atrocity is a matter of escalating commitments, as Waller puts it, so is helping behavior. According to Alliner and Alliner, rescuers frequently started down the path of risky self-sacrifice with limited attempts to help specific individuals for whom they had empathy. Over time, they found themselves committed to more extensive and generalized rescue. This kind of transformation is a strong version of the foot in the door effect. In one representative study of Foot in the Door, students who had been asked to sign a letter to the president emphasizing the need for assistance to the homeless were significantly more likely than those not previously contacted to agree to a larger request later on to take part on a food drive for the homeless. Such studies explain the amplification of altruism as a result of our need to maintain consistent self-perception. My previous actions show that I am an altruistic person who cares about this issue. Such a person would comply with this new larger request. However, if we feel that we have helped because we have been pressured or given strong financial incentives to do so, we are less likely to perceive ourselves as altruistic and therefore less likely to behave in a manner that is consistent with such a self-perception in the future. 7. Rescuers and perpetrators alike often characterize their behavior in the language of duress. I had no choice. The difference between them lies in where the orders are coming from. Speculatively, while many perpetrators feel coerced by external pressures or external models of personhood, I need to show others that I'm a real man, a real German, etc. Many rescuers, by contrast, feel coerced by internal pressures and internal models of personhood. Eva Fogelman writes, the Holocaust rescuers had a strong sense of who they were and what they were about. Their values were self-sustaining, not dependent on the approval of others. To them, what mattered most was behaving in a way that maintained their integrity. This kind of personhood parents like me believe can be cultivated. Philip Zimbardo, while best known for his studies showing how easily we slip into evil, in fact shares this optimistic view. He has a useful website, The Lucifer Effect, that details a range of practices we can adopt and features we can cultivate in each other to help us resist negative social influences and build capacities for moral heroism. I'll have to look that up. 8. If the pressure of cognitive dissonance makes us more likely to hold in contempt those we have hurt. Example, I have injured them, therefore they must be the sorts who deserve to be injured. It also makes us more likely to have positive feelings for those we have helped. If we are less likely to have empathy for those who have been trained to perceive as ugly or guilty, we are more likely to have empathy for those we have been trained to perceive as beautiful or innocent, and more likely to have empathy for children for both reasons. Studies show, moreover, that once we have experienced empathy for others, we will respond with less aggression to provocation from those same others. 9. If de-individuation can promote aggression, it can also promote benevolence. Ed Diner writes, de-individuation may release behaviors that many consider to be pro-social if those behaviors are inhibited by norms, by fear, or by long-term planning considerations. For example, the de-individuated person in a certain situation might be more likely to donate a large sum of money to charity, might be more likely to risk his or her life to help another, and might be more likely to kiss friends. All behaviors that many consider mandatory. Stephen Prentice Dunn and Ronald Rogers add that the de-individuated persons have been shown to follow the lead of models, and that non-aggressive models can reduce the transgression displayed by de-individuated individuals. 10. If atrocity is a matter of training, with an emphasis on early education, so is altruism. Study after study emphasizes parental influence as a key component for promoting altruistic behavior and aggression in adults. Alliner and Alliner identify several commonalities among rescuers, including the strong and cohesive family bonds, broad social commitments, and intense sense of personal responsibility for the welfare of society as a whole, and an egalitarian upbringing. Non-helpers, by contrast, were more likely to have had authoritarian upbringings. Other studies of personality traits associated with pro-social behavior see these regularities. Altruists are people high in self-esteem, high in competence, high in internal locus of control, low in need for approval, and high in moral development. They are higher trust and faith in people than non-altruists, a spirit of adventureness, a capacity for risk-taking, and an understanding of what it means to feel socially marginal. For most of the process above, storytelling is crucial. That is, exercises in narration and perspective taking can affect who we consider the in-group, how thin or thick a person's identity is to us, how we interpret the reactive behaviors of those around us, how we frame complex or confusing events, how we see ourselves, what we identify as central to the particular meanings of our lives. I said previously that information is coercive, but what I really meant was storytelling. As Sharif warns in discussing the Robbers Cave experiment, the dissemination of specific information designed to correct prevailing group stereotypes is relatively ineffective in changing attitudes. Stereotypes crystallized during the eventful course of competition and conflict with the outgroup are usually more real in the experience of the group members than bits of information handed down to them. Information can pressure us, but it is relatively easy to adapt our interpretive frameworks so as to accommodate new information without changing our basic beliefs or behaviors. Stories, by contrast, can short circuit circuit the mechanisms of cognitive consistency and make us have experiences, make us interiorize rather than simply consider the identities of others. But more on stories later. The primary point I want to emphasize here is this. For each powerful and structural force driving us towards inhumane treatment of others, there are equally powerful and structural forces available to us to promote pro-social behavior. Mark Ocel offers a detailed institutional model of this principle in his study, Obeying Orders. If war crimes are a result of disorganization among the forces, atrocity comes from below, then create a better bureaucracy within bright line rules rather than general discretionary standards to control the behavior of the soldiers. If atrocity is instead the result of strict, depersonalizing, top-down bureaucracy, atrocity comes from above, then the bureaucracy must be restructured to incorporate a democratic ethos and discipline, codifying generous qualifications and exceptions to the duty of obedience to superior orders, so that soldiers can reinterpret and resist illegal orders. If atrocities are then committed because of this discretion and ambiguity in orders, it will be for one of two reasons. First, soldiers might exploit ambiguity and latitude for discretion in order to create possibilities for unleashing frustration upon others, atrocity from below. Second, superiors might deliberately foster an atmosphere of discretion as a way of implicitly promising soldiers that extreme acts will not be punished and will possibly be rewarded, atrocity from above, rather than as a way of enabling soldiers to exercise restraint as conditions develop and complicate in the field. There are effective solutions for both possibilities. In the former case, emphasize the rule of manifest illegal. I cannot say that word. It's such an easy word. Manifest illegality, which holds troops responsible for criminal behavior independently of what they believe their orders require of them. In the latter, emphasize the rule of command responsibility, which holds superiors criminally responsible for the actions of subordinates. Finally, also argues training practices that brutalize troops, nurturing generalized hostility so that it might be turned upon the enemy, can be tempered by civilianizing of military law, for instance, by strengthening the due process protections owed to troops by officers, and the same sort of disciplinary rituals of reintegrate shaming that promotes reckless aggression can also be used to promote virtue. Just as marital cultures can produce bloody-minded behavior, they can produce restraint. The best prospects for minimizing war crimes, he concludes, derives from creating a personal identity based upon the virtues of chivalry and marital honor, virtues seen by officers as constitutive of good soldiering. It is a good thing to think strategically about ways to morally epitomize human behavior, but it seems to me that it also requires maintaining internal vigilance about how one conceptualizes the human. Here's the problem. While all the above are sincere attempts to think our way out of the process of depersonalization that release antisocial impulses, they also push us towards a model of self that is depersonalizing. The argument goes like this. Viewed in the aggregate and given certain conditions, our behaviors have a degree of predictability. This is a good thing. How else could we begin to regulate collaborative social life? It is because we have the capacity to step outside ourselves and view our behaviors in the aggregate, that is, view them objectively rather than subjectively, that we can design organizations that will promote behaviors we desire and inhibit those we disdain. However, when we model personhood from the aggregate standpoint, the infinite nuance of individuality seems less important than the location and organization or social group. And this not only flies in the face of our moment-by-moment sense of self, but also seriously undermines ideas that we organize our lives around, like integrity and authenticity. We experience ourselves from the inside, and our interior deliberations and personal freedom seems to matter a great deal from this angle. As philosopher Thomas Nagel argues, it is not that subjectivity appears limited and small, then the world is viewed from the objective standpoint. Subjectivity does not appear at all when the world is viewed from the objective standpoint. The two perspectives are mutually exclusive. Being careful about this split means, in this case, being careful not to suggest that extreme cruelty and extreme altruism reveal a universal truth about humans. That when certain psychological circuit trips, we become abstracted persons, depersonalized expressions of behavioral principle. Indeed, even the most apparently senseless violence can be a marker of cultural and individual specificity. Alexander Hinton suggests that perpetrators, however, constrained and even warped by circumstance, remain active subjects who construct meaning and assert their self-identity through their violent practices. Blame and resentment for injury are appropriate emotions because they are acknowledgement of another's agency. You can be angry that you hurt your foot on a rock, but you can't blame the rock. Blame is for those you respect as human. Okay, so now we're going back to Yuasa-san's testimony. Yuasa-san says, that was a long educational process, Yeah, in prison camp, I listened to Chinese people's stories, how they fought with the country of Japan and suffered a great deal, and they died. Through my daily education, watching developing conditions in China, I reflected on the unforgivable things I had done. And then finally, afterwards, I realized what you say, I realized. And so, but until then, I thought nothing about how to avoid my crimes when I could return home. But especially the time I realized it the most was just before I was released, when I received a letter from a Chinese mother. And that was, begins to recall the letter. Here's the letter that the Chinese mother wrote. Yuasa, I am the mother of, it's unclear who she was talking about, you performed a vivisection on. That day, my son was taken in by military police, and I was standing in front of him. I remember watching this, waiting in the dirty road, and afterward, a car came along, and you took him off somewhere. I panicked and ran down the hill. I lost sight of you, and a worried friend came by. Ma'am, a notice came that your boy was killed alive at such and such hospital. Oh, I cried and cried. I couldn't eat. I couldn't even plow a field. I just heard that you are in there and told the investigators that I wanted you to receive a harsh punishment. But my mental state was such that I didn't even fear harsh punishment, Rather, I said, ma'am, you have found the culprit, and I just bowed. Of the things I did, even if I thought at all about the people I killed, never before had my heart gone out to a family like this. I didn't think at all about that. I still think it's interesting that the Chinese re-educated the Japanese war criminals than killing them. That just blows my mind. To begin thinking about blame and repentance for war crimes like this, one must first give further consideration to the concept of evil. To judge something evil is to put the possibility of forgiveness into question in a way other judgments do not. What is evil? What can it be forgiven? Loosely conflating Kant's notion of radical evil with the Holocaust aren't rights. All we know is that we can neither punish nor forgive such offenses, and then that they therefore transcend the realm of human affairs and potentialities of human power, both of which they radically destroy wherever they make their appearance. Here, where the deed itself dispossesses us of all power, we can indeed only repeat with Jesus. If it were better for him that a milestone was hanged about his neck and he cast into the sea. Bye, Valley Girl. Is Arndt's characterization useful? Is the concept of evil itself useful? Once out from under the immediate shadow of the Holocaust, many scholars began to think not. The concept of evil, as various scholars have characterized the position, is simply a residue of an outdated theological perspective on the world. Evil is just bad plus God. Evil is a useless or unwanted word. Evil is a chimera like Santa Claus or the Tooth Fairy. Western philosophy. Why do we keep talking about Western philosophy to understand an Asian issue? Why? Western philosophy, in fact, has comparatively little to offer on evil. While wrongdoing has been a central topic of analysis, evil is not. Indeed, philosopher Claudia Card argues that a major strand of modern secular philosophy involves a denial of evil. Card tracks this back to the influence of Friedrich Nietzsche, who argued that the concept of evil, as opposed to the concept of bad, was a trick foisted upon the world by resentful slaves who wished to constrain the power of their natural masters. Explaining the slave result in morality, Nietzsche writes, lofty spiritual independence, the will to stand alone, great intelligence even, are felt to be dangerous. Everything that raises the individual above the herd and makes his neighbor quail is henceforth called evil. The fair, modest, obedient, and self-effacing disposition, the mean and average in desires, acquires moral names and honors. Card explains that contemporary philosophical thought had been shaped less by Nietzsche's claims about morality, that we should admire the proud strengths of the world's relentless Napoleons, than by his particular method of formulating such claims. Nietzsche's genealogy of morality, Card writes, helped us engineer a shift from questions of what to do to prevent, reduce, or redress evils to skeptical psychological questions about what inclines people to make judgments of evil in the first place. What functions such judgments have served? In other words, what is evil is a question for pastors and theologians, not philosophers, political scientists, or other humanists. Or it is not a particularly interesting question, or it is an interesting question only because it reveals something about the person asking it. Because defining evil is an attempt to disguise subject desire, its objective imperatives. Since 9/11, however, the concept of evil has resurged in Anglo-American scholarly research. Much of it has been involved the philosophical spadework of attempting to devise the comprehensively satisfying definition of evil. Philosophers ask questions such as, how hurtful does something have to be evil rather than extremely bad? And once we've determined that, what should be the difference in a response to each? Can accidents be evil, or is malicious intent necessary? If malicious intent is necessary, could it also be sufficient? For instance, what if malicious intent never translates into actual harm? This is persistently secular work. You can believe in evil without supposing that it's supernatural in origin, explains Terry Eagleton. Ideas of evil do not have to hoist a cloven hoof to Satan. In his own attempt to characterize evil, notably, Eagleton draws heavily from a view once dominant in Christian theology. The evil is fundamentally a privation of the good of being, that the desire for evil is a desire for the negation of being. The power of evil, he writes, is essentially that of death drive, turned outward so as to wreak its insatiable spitefulness on a fellow human being. Yet this furious violence involves a kind of lack, an unbearable sense of non-being, which must, so to speak, be taken out on each other. It is also oriented to another kind of absence, the nullity of death itself. Here, then, terrifying force and utter vexatiousness comes together. Eagleton is a modernized, psychoanalytically inflected version of the privative theory of evil that dates back to St. Augustine. Augustine was unflinching on evil, believing even in infant damnation. In his Confessions, Augustine recalls an incident from when he was 16 that dramatically illuminates his philosophy. And this is a point out of St. Augustine. I have his book Confessions somewhere, to be honest. There was a pear tree near a vineyard, loaded with fruit that was attractive, neither to look at nor to taste. Late one night, a band of ruffians, myself included, went off to shake down the fruit and carry it away, for we had continued our games out of doors until well after dark, as was our pernicious habit. We took away an enormous quantity of pears, not to eat them ourselves, but simply to throw them to the pigs. Perhaps we ate some of them, but our real pleasure consisted in doing nothing that was forbidden. Look into my heart, O God, the same heart on which you took pity when it was in the depths of the abyss. Let my heart now tell you what prompted me to do wrong for no purpose, and why it was only my own love of mischief that made me do it. The evil in me was foul, but I loved it. I loved my own perdition and my own faults, not the things for which I committed wrong, but the wrong itself. My soul was vicious and broke, away from the safekeeping to seek its own destruction, looking for no profit in disgrace, but only for disgrace itself. It's so many big words, snap face. Like sometimes I have to stop myself. Augustine's self-loathing is even more striking later when he compares his pear snatching to the atrocities of the Roman politician Catiline, villainized in the histories Augustine read, and judges his own crime the basser. Augustine here is radically and terrorizing evil, focusing more on perversion of the soul than suffering of the world, more on motivations for an action than the hurtful consequences. What is evil? Augustine insisted that it is a lack and absence. We therefore know the nature of evil by not knowing it, just as we perceive darkness by not seeing it and perceive silence by not hearing it. Ooh, that's interesting. That's an interesting little quote there. We may have malicious desires to harm somebody, but it could be purposeful. We are acting from anger, jealousy, revenge, or ambition. Or, more disturbing, it could be purposeless. We do it for no reason at all, or for the reason of evil itself. which is, in Augustine's thinking, non-being. Augustine's crime is the epitome of evil because he desires, quite literally, nothing. That's true. When we're more scared when we think of like criminals, like if people said they just killed to kill somebody, like no reasoning, that baffles us and seems more evil than when somebody has a plan, I think. Here, Eagleton once more, espousing an Augustinian view of evil, evil would actually prefer that there was nothing at all, since it does not see the point of created things. It loathes them because is itself a being is itself a kind of good. The more richly abundant existence is, the more value there is in the world. When one seeks evil, one seeks annihilation. Not only annihilation of other people and things, but also, and perhaps more certainly, annihilation of oneself. Okay, so now we're going to more about the actual story. So Dawes, the author says, when he looks back now at the man he was then, what does he see? During the war, the man he was in the war, what does he see? Interpreter asks, with this person you are now in the present day, how do you see? View the person you were during the war. Kaneko-san replies, I think I was evil. What I did, however, okay, but we felt very strongly that war to the end was something that if from now on we get rid of, that it shouldn't happen. I think the things we did were really evil. We killed, we raped, because we didn't do anything really good, We robbed, we took kind, we took wheat, the kind of thing, we took mountains of it, okay? The wheat, where do you think it went? I haven't got a damn clue. Dawes, the author, can he make up for what he did? Interpreter, make up meaning that do that again? Dawes, no, he can make up is there redemption for him? Interpreter, redemption in the sense, Dawes, is there a way to pay back what he did? Interpreter, so Mr. Kaneko, supposing you were able to atone for that. Kaneko-san goes, which is like, what? Interpreter, if you were to atone, what sort of things? Kaneko-san asks, what's that? Interpreter asks again, if you were to atone. Kaneko-san, that, of course, is opposing the war. Interpreter, of course. Kaneko-san replies, that I will not fight such a war twice. No, not that sort of war. War itself I won't fight. Yeah, at this kind of time, this isn't our, theory. This isn't a theory we came up with. This is out of what really experienced. When we lived through it, this is what we felt. Dawes, does he feel free of what he did now? Does he? Is he redeemed? Interpreter asks, do you think you have been forgiven now for the things you've done? Kaneko-san, when it comes right down to it, I think I've really been forgiven, and it's because of that we stress that we won't allow that sort of thing to happen twice, that we can't do that. This is our atonement. If I were to put it simply, that is what we are doing. Yeah, America isn't the greatest country ever either. Japan has repeatedly acknowledged imperial war crimes and apologized for them, construing apology in a particular way. In 1995, the Japanese parliament passed a resolution to renew the determination for peace on the basis of lessons learned from history. Originally intended to be an official apology, it became instead an expression of remorse over Japan's aggression-like acts that lumped together Japanese war crimes with the many instances of colonial rule and acts of aggression in the modern history of the world. The Prime Minister later added his apology, but as Norma Field points out, did so only at the same time that he insisted the Showa emperor bore no responsibility for the mistaken state policy. Over the years, in relations with Taiwan, Korea, and China, Field explains Japan has expressed regret for unfortunate events, made declarations of being truly regretful for it, and deeply reflecting upon the unfortunate period of colonialism, inserted keenly feeling responsibility for, and deeply reflecting upon the great loss inflicted upon the people of China. And Muira finds in a series of resolutions passed by prefectural assemblies around the same time in a similar pattern of evasive acknowledgement. Condolences for the hardships suffered by other Asian nations are coupled with explanations that Japanese soldiers died to guarantee the safety of their country and to ensure its future prosperity. Meanwhile, Field writes, reconciliation and reparations have taken the form of loans and credit that paved the way for the penetration of Japanese capital into neighboring countries, along with a fund to collect private donations for sympathy money for comfort women. Because it is a private sympathy money, Field notes, it is divorced from the notion of state responsibility for wrongdoings. Moreover, it produces a patron-client relationship that troubles many. Sympathy money, said Son Shindo, a former comfort woman who filed a civil suit for an official apology and compensation, is just going to make people look askance at us. In a study of Japanese history textbooks, Christopher Bernard sees a series of subtle rhetorical maneuvers designed to minimize responsibility and agency. For instance, he notes, the rape of Nanking is widely acknowledged in textbooks, but frequently with the qualifier that the Japanese people did not know about the atrocities at the time, and always in grammatical structures that presented as an anonymous organizational crime. Which we know is not true because I had pictures of the school children celebrating the invasion of Nanking. So they're full of some bullshit. And not one single textbook, it is stated that the Japanese soldier killed Chinese people. Many of these acknowledgments, moreover, suffer from overwording, a layering of synonyms identifiers that reveal an effort to avoid making a particular identification, and from passive constructions. If the Nanking incident occurs, to take one example, it's as if nobody did it, it just happened. Perhaps unsurprisingly, over the years that I have worked on this project, several people have asked me, you keep talking about confessions and apologies and even redemption. Do you think these words mean the same thing to them as to you? Isn't what confession means for them, with its ties both to communist political practice and sincerity and Confucian thought, very different from what confession means for you, with its ties both to Augustine and Rousseau and to psychoanalysis? In the very early stages of this project, I sometimes explained to fellow academics in conversation that I was spending time in Japan to take confessions from war criminals. I quickly learned not to do that. In using that language of both the church and the police station, wasn't I implicating myself in confession as a cultural form explained by Michael Foucault? This is a system of power knowledge that produces truth as a form of social control. In the West, we treat confession as a revelation, even creation of the unfeathered, authentic self. Oh, my mouth is dry. But Foucault writes, the confession is also a ritual that unfolds within a power relationship. For one does not confess without the presence or virtual presence of a partner who is not simply the interlocutor, but the authority who requires the confession, prescribes and appreciates it, and intervenes in order to judge, punish, forgive, console, and reconcile. A ritual in which the truth is corroborated by the obstacles and resistance it had to surmount in order to be formulated. And finally, a ritual in which expression alone, independently of its external consequences, produce intrinsic modifications in the person who articulates it. It exonerates, redeems, and purifies him. It unburdens him of his wrongdoings, liberates him, and promises him salvation. When I look at this quotation, I think about something that happened in a moment of organizational confusion during my time in Japan. One of the local activists involved became frustrated. He had an agitated exchange with our interpreter. Later, we pressed her for details, but she demurred. While she never revealed what he said in full, it finally became clear that the activists, an anti-nationalist communist devoted to the cause of forcing Japan to confess its imperial war crimes, had expressed in that moment deep bitterness about how the very same white Westerners who had bombed their cities had come once again to make their men kneel before them. I know the reasons I went to do and what I did. I am at peace with the reason, but then how different do I think I am? The theory and practice of human rights has changed dramatically in recent years, but we cannot shrug aside a long history of ignoring torture and structural violence in our own backyards in favor of discovering it in lands of racial others. Sometimes colleagues express flip side concerns to me. Concerns not about what I was up to, but about what the soldiers were up to. Why do you think these men told you the stories at all? And why in the way they did? What effect were they hoping to achieve? As a literary critic, I can't help but think of them as a genre questions. In her remarkable study of perpetrators in Argentina, Chile, Brazil, and South Africa, Lee Payne explains that confessions are not windows to the soul. Indeed, they do not even necessarily represent a claim to truth. They are instead performances, complete with actors, script, stage, and audience, and they are subgenres to confession. They can range from expressions of deep remorse to heroic justifications, denial, and sadism. Pain identifies a remorseful confession, the kind I am working with, and the kind most commonly seen as compatible with reconciliation, as a born-again narrative device that allows individuals to trade their sinful past for saintly presence. Like all confessions, she explains, they allow perpetrators to reinvent their past through narrative. Hi, Cherry. Hi, Shelby. Oh, yeah. Shelby, I'm sorry. I forgot to change it from tonight. I just keep copying and pasting from the same thing. That's probably why. I'm sorry. When injured, we crave remorse, but the remorseful confession is not necessarily less socially contentious when the heroic, self-justifying confession. Audiences rarely accept the sincerity of perpetrator remorse, so exceptional performances are required for success. And even if sincerity is well performed, remorse may not work. Remorse is irrelevant, declares Anne Maria Carriaga, a torture survivor from Argentina's dirty war. As Payne writes, for many, remorse is a bait to be rejected because it sets in motion a process that pressures victims and survivors to grant perpetrators the profit of moral self-restoration. Held to a standard of mental health and magnanimous spirit not expected of perpetrators, victims and survivors must forgive. They are expected to be grateful and to regard the confessions as unexpected and generous gifts. Remorseful confessions, Payne concludes, are felt to place undue burden on those who have already suffered, victims and survivors, in the name of individual and national healing. In whatever form they come, confessions can function as a renewal of trauma. Witnesses, particularly victims and survivors of authoritarian state violence, do not experience confessions at a safe and critical distance, but are as part of their present lives. Perpetrators' confessions invade their safe spaces. On top of that, confessions can also traumatize bystanders and post-authoritarian era generations, particularly victims of physical or psychological abuse. I've been haunted by such thoughts since starting the project. I hear them in my head like quiet voices. These men had the power of gods during the war. They could grant life or take it away with a word, and their victims had nothing. And all these years later, you are giving them all the power once again. For a long time, I couldn't write anything, listening to these voices. And yet individual institutions and cultures require confessions. They continually seek them out because confessions fill a basic need. They are antidotes to the physically poisonous social silence of authoritarian violence, a silence that perpetuates victims' self-blame, confusion, and rage, a silence that functions almost like a massive and cruel conformity experiment. We don't see what you see. It made you psychotic, Renee Eppelbaum, a member of the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, says of the lies and distortions of the dirty war. We could barely read, let alone translate the world around us. And what was exactly what they wanted. Forgiveness aside, confessions can play a vital role in healing individuals and societies because they fight contaminated state fictions, because they make it more difficult for public discourse to violently deny the personal realities of survivors. Confessions rebuild social reality. Oh my God, that's so much. I read a lot today. I read almost 30-something pages. 52 minutes sounds like a good time. We are so close. We have only this much. Less than 100 pages left. Look at, we almost finished a book. Oh, I actually like this because I like that people enjoy listening, and I haven't read that many books, but when people want to hear it, then I read books. This will be the next book. This one we can do like once a week because this one is like this one's a little bit more wordier. But it talks about it talks about a lot of interesting women characters. This book, this is like what the book's about. Are bad girls casualties of patriarchy, unnecessary evil, or visionary pioneers? The author in this volume proposed shifts in our perceptions of bad girls, providing new ways to understand them through the case of Japan. By tracing the concept of the bad girl as a product of specific cultural assumptions and historical settings, Bad Girls of Japan maps new roads and old detours and revealing a disorderly politics of gender. It explores deviancy in richly diverse media. Mountain witches, murderers, performance artists, cartoonists, schoolgirls, and shoppers gone wild are all part of the terrain. Bad Girls of Japan is not intended as another exotic tour through Weird Japan or Sex Paradise Japan. It is a scholarly and creative approach to understanding the ways in which the proper roles of girls and women have been defined, debated, and deliberately transgressed in Japan, past and present. So I think what I'll do is I can make this a once a week thing where I'll go ahead and read the chapter, and then I'll do a PowerPoint presentation so that I can read to you and then give examples and more backstory. So like with this book, there's a lot of like big ideas, like sociological terms, philosophical terms, philosophers like Rousseau and Augustine that maybe you guys aren't familiar with. And though you might not grasp the entirety of what the author is trying to compare or say and contrast at the time, but if I would have read it ahead, I could have like furthering examples or like stuff to make it a little bit more easier to read. So you could be single like me, Carl. But I am going to go for the day. I am working on a new show. Well, a new episode on the Otaku Killer. What's his name? Tsutomu Miyazaki? Is that his name? Tsutomu Miyazaki. So that one's going to be very horrific. I've already started putting it together. So that'll be good. So yeah, we're getting there. So I appreciate everybody coming to listen to me yap every morning. So everyone have a good day. Susan, Sherry, Shelby, Carl. Oh, who else did we have in here? Snap, Lou, Talana. I know Valley Girl left. I think that was everyone. Charlotte was here too. And Sam. Bye, Charlotte. You guys all have a great day. I love you. And I will see you guys later. Bye.